Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to another day of the second wave of the pandemic, Science and Society. Our guest today is Dr. Martha Lincoln, an assistant professor of anthropology at San Francisco State University. She is a medical and cultural anthropologist whose fieldwork is based in Vietnam and the United States. Her research interests include the public health effects of political economy and the cultural politics of health. She will be presenting a talk titled The Cultural Politics of Remembering COVID-19. Welcome, Dr. Lincoln.
Thanks so much, Dr. Milich, for the invitation to join this amazing class and this amazing group of students today from Oakland. It is an honor to be here, and I hope everybody is remaining safe and well in St. Louis or wherever you happen to be. So just as like a point of process, if you have any questions, we will be keeping track of those. I may not be able to see those immediately, but any clarifying questions will get addressed or brought to my attention at that time. And there should also be some time for your questions at the end. So I will be looking forward to your feedback. I'm also happy to receive your questions in email. There will be a couple of spots where I pause to ask for your quick comments in the chat, and I will be seeing those. So let me share some slides. And yeah, I have a fair amount to cover today. So let me jump us in. So from the very first moments of the pandemic, I bet some of you have noticed this, there has been a lot of discourse about the relationship of our present moment to the sweep of historic time. We have seen a lot of news stories asking where this experience fit in US or world history, whether history was repeating itself in some way, whether we were going to be going back to normal or not, whatever that meant, and how we'd remember this when it was all, in some way over. And as we've asked those questions, I think we've started down the road to remembering the coronavirus pandemic, kind of pre-membering that experience, if you will. And in media, there has been a lot of demand for historic anecdotes and facts that could help construct some kind of coherent narrative of our experience, and perhaps also predict what the future was going to hold. I'm not a historian, but as a medical anthropologist, I've nonetheless been asked to speak to these questions. Where are we going? Where have we been? Quite a lot over this past year. And these are just a sampling on the slide. This is like a few of the many hundreds and perhaps thousands of news stories that have been published over the past year, pulling some episode or issue out of history to compare to our situation in the present day. What I want to share with you today is not all the facts that I've personally pulled out of the archive to help journalists write stories, even though some of them are really interesting and fun. What I want us to discuss is the broader significance of memory. How do we remember and forget collectively? What are the consequences of remembering and forgetting? How indeed are we going to remember COVID-19? And why is it important for us to be thinking about that now? So let's begin with a word about why memory is important. Fundamentally, memory is a way for us to make sense of the events that we experience. What we remember is important to our identity. It's a core part of who we believe ourselves to be. However, as research has intriguingly established, people don't remember events as if we were computers. One, we don't remember everything that we experience, we forget. And two, what we do remember, we may not remember entirely correctly. So if you're interested in the psychological basis of memory, You might check out the work of the experimental psychologist Nancy Loftus, who has spent her career researching how people remember. And she is famous for one of her studies demonstrating that memories can be induced. In this experiment, a family member would tell someone, a study participant, a story about how when they were very little, they had gotten lost in a shopping mall. And this was not true. The person had not ever gotten lost at a shopping mall and been found crying, or like none of that had happened. Yet surprisingly many of the study participants claimed to remember that they had a memory of that having happened. And when they were pressed for, details of the story, they would present details of something that had never happened. Loftus also did an experiment where she'd show people a short film of a car accident, and she'd ask them one of two questions. Either, how fast were the cars going when they hit? Or how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? People who heard the question with the word smashed predictably said that the cars were going faster. And they also believed that they had seen broken glass in the movie, even though there was no broken glass. Okay, so all that is to say, individual memories can be shaped. What we remember and the sense that we make of those memories is not always based on fact. And to complicate matters, memory is not just an individual level phenomenon. We also remember socially and collectively. So let's look a little bit more at collective memory. Collective memory, or social memory, takes the form of visible, tangible, public acts and practices. And it also takes the form of stories and narratives that we share. So things that we actively practice, communicate, or perform in order to remember. For example, the writing of history curriculum, which essentially institutionalizes one version of the past for kids in school. We also remember collectively by, for example, building monuments or putting items in a museum collection. Those are ways of collectively making sense of the past. There are also ways of making one version of historic events seem true, official, and authoritative. So that slippery quality in individual memory, we see it in collective memory also. In fact, I think we may see that slipperiness more in groups than in individuals, at least in some ways. So let me give you an example of collective memory and its uses. And this is not going to be related to the coronavirus pandemic, which maybe you would like a short break from. We'll be getting back to that, okay? So as you may or may not be aware, there's a part of Ireland that's politically separate from the rest of the country, and it's called Northern Ireland. You can see it in that map on the left, those 6 counties in a different color. That's Northern Ireland, and it's been under the jurisdiction of not the Irish government, but the British government since 1921. There are 2 communities there, Catholic and Protestant, and Protestants are the majority group in Northern Ireland. In the Republic of Ireland, it's majority Catholic, but in Northern Ireland, it's majority Protestant. And Protestants are culturally and politically allied with Britain. They've historically had a lot more economic and political advantage than their Catholic counterparts. And beginning in 1969, those disparities turned into armed conflict, actually, with Catholic and Protestant paramilitary groups taking up arms. And that conflict, which you may be familiar with, called the Troubles, lasted until 1999, when a ceasefire agreement was signed, and officially the sides stood down. If you know the show Dairy Girls, you've seen a suggestion of what life was like in Northern Ireland before the Good Friday Agreement. And when I was a college student, I spent a year in Belfast right after that agreement was signed. Belfast is the capital of Northern Ireland, so it's like a bit cosmopolitan, but it's still like very, very profoundly sectarian, right? And as an American, I was really stunned by how segregated the city was and by how conscious people were of religious identity, like in all ways. And even though the ceasefire was in place, people were still just extremely watchful of like who was around them. It's not that big a city. It's a relatively small-ish town, but it's big enough that I was surprised when I would meet people who knew who I was because they had seen me in some other part of the city. Like I found that really spooky. And I thought it spoke to just how kind of actively people were like scanning the surroundings around them. So these communities are very divided. People tend to live in neighborhoods that are like all one religion, but there are areas where like a Catholic neighborhood will abut a Protestant neighborhood. And consequently, there are streets where Catholic people would only walk down one side and Protestant people would only walk down the other. If you met somebody in a club or like a bar, like someplace not in your neighborhood, and you thought they were cute and you maybe wanted to see them again, you would ask them what high school they went to as a way of knowing whether they were the right religion. So things would not get like too far ahead before, So anyway, I found all this really stunning. And I was also stunned to learn that some people believed, like completely seriously believed, that Catholic and Protestant people belonged to different races, that there were actual categorical, biological, and genetic differences between members of those groups. And that really startled me because I could not tell people there apart, like at all. Not by their accents, not by their clothes, not by their appearances, nothing. Like I could never guess predictably what somebody's religion was. And so this thing about genetics, I was like, wow, like these communities to an outsider are indistinguishable, but they've invented a history where they're not even related to each other. So, okay, so finally in Belfast, there's just a lot of awareness of history and a lot of commemoration of political anniversaries. On the right of this slide, you can see a couple of murals. One above from a Catholic community, that's Bobby Sands, who's really almost kind of like a secular saint in some ways there. And then on the bottom, you can see a Protestant mural of Oliver Cromwell, who also has kind of like a saint quality for Protestants. There are murals like this all over Belfast, reminding people of history. And every July, groups of Protestant extremists, basically, would march through Catholic neighborhoods to celebrate the victory of King William of Orange, who's Protestant, over King James II, who's Catholic, at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690. And those marches were received with a lot of anger and sometimes also violence, like they would cause clashes. But Protestants who participated in so-called marching season would claim that this was a way of celebrating their history. Essentially, this was a way of deploying one episode in history to exercise symbolic dominance over Catholic communities in the present day. So this is to say, and here we're kind of curving back towards coronavirus in the US. This is to say that history and memory are places where social conflicts are enacted and reenacted. And groups often make use of historical symbols and stories to support the legitimacy of their side's claims. John Nagel, who's a sociologist, has written about Northern Ireland after the ceasefire, and he focuses on how that conflict has percolated into cultural spaces like St. Patrick's Day celebrations. And there had never been any St. Patrick's Day celebrations in Belfast prior to 1999. And then they started having them in the city center, which is seen as a kind of like interfaith or like non-sectarian spot in the city. So these were supposed to be events where people like forgot about their historic grievances and let go of the past to be one, unified community. But nobody forgot, like nobody forgot the hostilities. And as one example, both Catholics and Protestants actively claimed that St. Patrick, who lived in the 5th century, had played a role, like an important kind of seminal role in founding their version of Christianity. And both sides accused the other side of like historical manipulation in their claims to St. Patrick. One unionist politician said, "We should proudly proclaim St. Patrick as ours." And I think there's a willingness to not allow people, meaning Catholics, to hijack him. Anyone who has factual knowledge of the history of St. Patrick knows that he was a prototype Protestant. So you guys have probably observed St. Patrick's Day in the US, and you know that that is not the sort of like mainstream image of that holiday. Like that is really like a Celtic, Catholic, Irish nationalist holiday. But there's all this conflict because of the efforts on both sides to claim a piece of history. So commenting here, John Nagel writes, "By striving to monopolize memories, groups seek to gain hegemonic power." In case you're not familiar with the term hegemony, let me just take a moment on that. So Nagel's talking about a kind of cultural or ideological domination in which a group normalizes its worldview and positions it as if it were universally valid. So by claiming St. Patrick's Day as a Protestant holiday, Protestants are using historic memory or a version of historic memory to normalize their worldview, making their version of reality seem valid and legitimate. So in this way, collective memory does political and ideological work. One, because what we do in the present is shaped by what we remember, and two, because we remember the past and make references to history, not only to know who we are, but also to pursue real world, present day political advantages. Okay, so now at this point, I bet you were wondering, like, what does this have to do with the pandemic? Okay, in the United States, again, we have been trying to remember the pandemic, to write its history, or to write it out of history, basically since the very first cases were diagnosed. And I think some of us have had the sense that this is an epochal moment, like a once in a lifetime thing. And there's also been, I think, a very strong understanding that whoever could control the story of the pandemic and get the biggest buy-in on that story would be able to win other political victories as a result. And this is complex because, you know, it's not just like there are Democrats and Republicans in the United States. Very complicated political terrain, cultural terrain here. Lots of different interest groups have been fighting over, you know, the authoritative story of the pandemic. But let's simplify somewhat and say, you know, just for our purposes momentarily, that US politics are either essentially left-wing or essentially right-wing, essentially aligned with Democrats or essentially aligned with Republicans, okay? And so as the pandemic began gathering force last year, right-wing politicians and public figures made a quite concerted effort to diminish public awareness and concern about this disease. You may remember some of this rhetoric, a few quotes. President Trump saying last February that one day, like a miracle, it will disappear. So this was obviously notorious, infamous comment. Ron Johnson, senator from Wisconsin, Republican, said, "We don't shut down our economy because people die on the highways. It's a risk we accept so that we can move around." Lieutenant Governor of Texas, Dan Patrick, said that Texas should reopen because there are more important things than living. Intriguing. And then in late September, the president continued to insist that coronavirus affected virtually nobody. And then after getting out of the hospital in October, he claimed, again, it's going to disappear. Okay, so I know you guys know these are very flawed claims, many issues with these appeals, but I think they were actually intended seriously. And they were certainly, in some parts of the country, at least, received seriously. And they've had a significant impact on the way that we've conceptualized and remembered the pandemic thus far, from early moments. The way we've remembered the people who were affected by disease and died from it have been shaped. I think even if we did not, ourselves individually believe that any of these comments were true, like there was kind of like a disturbance in the force around how we saw these issues. Okay, so to draw another point of comparison, I want to just reference briefly the events around September 11th, which I think if you are a traditionally aged college student, you do not have a personal immediate memory of, because you were born between 1999 and 2003, about. So you're going to have to take my word that when those attacks took place, they were front page news for weeks, months, with all media, regardless of political alignment, telling a very similar story about what had happened and what it meant. And they reported exhaustively on everybody who died. And I can assure you that at that time, nobody said, you know what, it's not really a lot of death. Nobody said, this is maybe like a bad flu season. Nobody said there are more important things than living. And nobody said, Al-Qaeda someday, like a miracle, is going to disappear. So compare that to last year. With the pandemic, we did not have a coherent national agreement that the pandemic really mattered, that it was a defining moment for our country, and that those who are dying from COVID really needed to be marked out and remembered in some way. Last May, as mortality was really escalating, we were losing Americans at a rate equivalent to 12 plane crashes a day, as one editorial pointed out. But our national process of memorializing those deaths was really absent. And I think that's continued to be the case, such that to this point, there has been no unifying symbol or practice or place that's summed up the meaning of all of those deaths in a comprehensive way. And paradoxically, I think, as deaths have become more numerous, it's become harder to convey the meaning of those losses in ways that are emotionally affecting, that seem compelling. To take an example from the New York Times, which is our paper of record, I think they have attempted, very successfully often, to report on the pandemic in a way that's scientifically informed, that's timely, that's comprehensive. But I think they've also had something of an uphill struggle, particularly as the number of deaths has increased. I think the Times has often reported the pandemic as if it were a statistical phenomenon, with particular attention paid when the death toll has reached big round numbers. So let me show you an example of what that has looked like. These are two front pages of the New York Times, one from last May and one from this February. And these were marking two big, numerical milestones, 100,000 deaths and then 500,000 deaths. And last May, what the Times decided to do was to run the whole front page with 1,000 of the 100,000 people named and a one-sentence obituary per person. Then this February, trying to capture, I think, the way deaths had accelerated over the winter months in this data visualization, the Times ran this infographic depicting 500,000 deaths with dots. Okay, here's a place where I'm going to pause. I wonder if you guys have thoughts about this approach.
So you can go ahead and type in the Q&A box any response you have to that image.
It's hard to realize every dot is a life. Ethan's comment. Yeah, it's hard to realize that every dot is a life. I absolutely agree. I think this is a real, this is just a sticky thing for media to convey the enormity and the scope, you know, like the enormous amount of death that this country has struggled with, while conveying at the same time that you know, any of these individual lives lost is a tragedy, you know, a premature death. So as important as these numbers are for what they represent, I think we do get into trouble when this is the angle that we settle on. People struggle to get a handle on big numbers.
And, you know, I'll just add to that, a lot of students are also saying how those dots are dehumanizing.
Indeed, yeah, I do agree. And I think this is unfortunate. It's just, you know, like, it's unfortunate to have so many deaths that you cannot represent them all in a more nuanced, qualitative way that conveys something of the humanity of each person. And we will have more to say about this. But we're gonna be in this predicament, I think, culturally, socially, politically. Like, this will be an ongoing issue. So where I want to take this is, I think that media, in attempting, you know, to push back against this kind of Trump-led discourse of, you know, like, there's no pandemic, these don't matter, these aren't people, these people aren't important, they were going to die anyway. In order to push back against those messages, center to left-leaning media have fallen into what I think are some imperfect solutions. And this is what my essay is about. If you got a chance to read that, you know where we're going. But this is going to be where we stay for a moment, is looking at this very frequently reported news angle, which compares COVID deaths to other high casualty events in history, specifically wars in which American troops have fought. So this is an image from last June in Fortune magazine, comparing COVID-19 to a couple of mass disease events, 1918 influenza and the 1968 pandemic, which has been, I think, really forgotten, the so-called Hong Kong flu. But all the other lines in this chart are wars where US troops were committed. Let's look at a few more. I just want you guys to get a sense of like what a kind of commonly referenced trope this was in media. Here we see charts that Statista and the New York Times produced earlier this year. And over the past year, there have been similar infographics in USA Today, National Geographic, US News and World Report, Time Magazine, etc. So a comparison to war has been a recurring trope. And when we look at these, I think, you know, if I'm receiving these the way they're intended to be received, I think Americans are supposed to feel maybe somber, concerned, reflective. I wonder if you guys want to drop in the chat, like, any responses that you have when you look at these comparisons. Alarmed, right. Yeah, I see these comments. Interesting. Okay, so there's some thoughtful analysis here in your comments. So the comparisons with World War I are interesting because more soldiers died of influenza than from combat. So the death toll of the war is also the death toll of the pandemic, and that isn't communicated well, right? There's a lot of stuff being covered over or like smoothed over in these presentations. All these other high casualty events are instances of murder. While I do believe COVID-19 is a national tragedy that should be taken seriously, perhaps it is this notion of intentional murder that resonates more with people. Perhaps this is why, okay, interesting. You guys are thoughtful critics of news media. Like to see it. If you have more thoughts about this, we'll pick those up. But for the moment, what I want to say is that I think what these charts are doing is presenting an ideological argument that may not be easy for us to see, because there's some things getting naturalized here and made to seem like they're common sense. Essentially, we're being asked to file pandemics into the category of wars that our nation fought. And we're also being asked to file pandemic deaths into the category of fallen American soldiers. But we're not supposed to ask, why do Americans fight so many wars? And we're also not supposed to ask, for example, what does it mean that our strongest way of saying in this country that your death is a real tragedy is by comparing it to the death of somebody who died fighting in a war overseas? But maybe some of you are thinking, I wonder if some of you are thinking this, well, like, why not? Pandemics do cause a lot of death, and wars also cause a lot of death. So why not put them together in a chart? As I'm arguing in this essay, again, I think we get into trouble when we naturalize this comparison. In part, I think we may run the risk of apathy when we ask Americans to care about deaths by reminding them of other deaths, especially if those took place in the relatively distant past. And I wonder, for example, why media don't compare COVID cases and deaths to living populations rather than to casualty totals. At this point in the pandemic, if we took all the people who had died from COVID-19, they would be equivalent to a city the size of about Albuquerque, almost as big as Milwaukee, almost twice as big as St. Louis. And to me, I think that might seem more emotionally affecting and compelling than saying, for example, more losses than in the Korean War. But let's look back at this issue of war comparisons. I want to turn to one specific comparison that has been doing a lot of ideological heavy lifting, and that is the comparison between COVID-19 under Trump and the experience of the Vietnam War in this country. So let me show you some examples. So here's a piece from the Washington Post. This highlighted excerpt at the top draws that same comparison between the pandemic death toll and our military dead in the Vietnam War. And then the author goes a step past that comparison to suggest that US failures to control the pandemic are reminiscent of the way that we lost the war, and that the way Vietnam is managing COVID is reminiscent of the way that it succeeded against us. This is called an argument by analogy, which is necessarily going to be a flawed argument. And I'm particularly not sure that this analogy works, because obviously, like, Vietnam succeeding in its efforts to control the pandemic, that has nothing to do, no logical relationship to the US failing in ours. Like, we could have done a fine job, independent of what happened in Vietnam, okay? So here's another opinion essay from the Washington Post, also critical of Trump, and that title is, the headline is a reference to his having dodged the draft in Vietnam. So another think piece making the same kind of argument that the pandemic is Trump's Vietnam. Let's look at a paragraph of this piece. So the author's arguing this war, i.e. COVID-19, will be won, but the most enduring consequences of Vietnam, a loss of national prestige, have been repeated. While other nations display competence, the United States, with the highest caseload in the world, asks for help from other countries. We receive relief supplies from Russia. Okay, so we see here that the author is making an appeal to history as a way to develop the apparent authority of their argument about the present day. They're invoking the Vietnam War, which ended almost 50 years ago, to say that what is happening now under Trump is wrong. But what's disturbing about this commentary, at least to me, is that while this is ostensibly like a left-wing perspective, it ends up being very ethnocentric. Are you guys seeing that? Okay, so for one, the author is using Vietnam as shorthand for American failure. And there's a common saying in Vietnam studies world that Vietnam is a country, not a war. So we try not to use Vietnam in that way to like signify the US screwing up. And he's also arguing that the most enduring consequences of the war is lost national prestige for the United States. I can think of some other enduring consequences of that war, and we will get to those in a minute. But I might also note that when I look at these editorials from last year, suggesting somehow that COVID is like Vietnam or like the North Vietnamese army, and positioning Americans specifically as victims, I see a relationship to the wave of anti-Asian sentiment in this country that we've seen recently. And so while these are overtly statements against like an incompetent president, I think they can also be read as kind of anti-Asian. And I'll just add, funny thing is that when this piece was written last April, the United States was not only receiving aid from Russia, we were also getting aid from Vietnam because they were doing a great job of handling the pandemic. So they sent us, I think they sent us masks. But somehow the author couldn't quite bring themselves to like take their commentary that far. Okay, so showing you some more headlines just so you get a sense of the kind of staying power of this idea. Many various comparisons being made between what happened over the past year in this country and what happened to us apparently in the war. This last one is a piece by a Vietnam veteran, and I do mention it in the essay that you read. The author wrote, "The parallels between the disease and the war are everywhere." And I think this was the piece that actually kind of like broke me a little bit and made me want to write and think more about what the Vietnam War was doing in all of these think pieces. Like, what are these parallels supposed to be? Like, does this make sense? What do these things really have to do with each other? Like the coronavirus pandemic, you know, becoming like a human tragedy and disaster in the United States, and a war that Americans do not have very clear memories of. Okay, so here is where I want to take a moment to reflect on the Vietnam War a bit, because I want to show you why I think this comparison is problematic and kind of dangerous. And in my experience, typically students do not have like a really clear memory themselves of learning about the Vietnam War. I think it's taught very badly in general in high schools for sure, and maybe also in universities. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background about the Vietnam War, or as it's sometimes called in Vietnam, the American War. It took place from 1965 to 1975 with the United States, as well as troops from Australia, South Korea, New Zealand, Thailand, supporting the Republic of Vietnam or South Vietnam against the Democratic Republic of Vietnam or North Vietnam, communist country. Now, from a military standpoint, this war was an absolute disaster for Americans, a fiasco. It was sometimes referred to as a quagmire. A highly, highly unpopular war. It became very controversial in US domestic politics, with those controversies, I think, in ways remaining unsettled, perhaps as long as up to today. And as a result, I think of those conflicts that we experienced here in the US, like cultural and political struggles over the war. The Vietnam War has been like endlessly memorialized in US public and popular culture. Yet, for all that memory work, Americans have certainly not held off from further wars of foreign intervention, quite the contrary. And so while the Vietnam War is sometimes cited as a reason why we should not intervene overseas, it's also been marshaled as evidence for why we should. In 2007, George W. Bush made like a very publicized argument about how when the US pulled out of Vietnam, we left behind a great deal of human suffering. And that was why we should stay in Iraq. And so that drew a lot of controversy too, but like obviously like a very kind of revised version of history had come up from the ashes and was motivating political decisions by the US in the present day. So much as in Northern Ireland, Americans have continued to fight over what the true version of history may be. And we make use of the memory of the war to serve group interests in our time. There have been many, many popular films and documentaries made about the war in Vietnam, but regardless of their politics, whether they are sympathetic to the anti-war side or whether they're supportive of US intervention, American films about the war typically provide a very US-centric portrait, presenting either war as like an American military epic that's like the Rambo films, Platoon, like some of those like big kind of popular Vietnam movies, Apocalypse Now, or they position it as an American moral tragedy, you know, something that really damaged Americans, like our national conscience. They tend to exclude Vietnamese people. And I'll give you guys an example of that. You're probably familiar with the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., which is an attempt to name every single person who died in the war, right? In chronological order with no like rank or military unit information, just name upon name upon name. And it's often lauded for how exhaustive and how democratic it is. However, if you go and check out that memorial, you will see not one Vietnamese person named, even though that was a war that we fought allegedly on behalf of South Vietnam and South Vietnamese people. And the South Vietnamese military were our allies. We worked very, very closely with them. Vietnamese people translated for US troops. They accompanied them militarily, like they were our, you know, they were our people. And our memorial names none of their dead. When US memory work does include Vietnamese people, it tends to present quite two-dimensional portraits of Vietnam's people, history, culture, and society. And if you guys saw Spike Lee's movie, Defy Bloods last year, you've seen an example of this, because while it's very important, I think it's very worthwhile to tell the story of Black GIs who served in Vietnam. That movie also unfortunately presented some of the ugliest and I think most cliched stereotypes of Vietnamese people and what the country is like. However, the anthropological literature on Vietnam is really fascinating. And so if you guys will forgive me for just like a moment, one slide, I want to show you just a little bit of it. Okay, so this is work on war legacies specifically in Vietnam. And Vietnamese people understand that if somebody dies violently, especially if their body is fragmented, can't be retrieved, can't be buried, like can't be brought home, then that person's spirit is going to linger unhappily and potentially also maliciously. And those spirits are capable of possessing living people and making them act in ways that they and other people will consider like really disturbing. And the war obviously created thousands, like if not millions, of unclaimed lost bodies, and therefore of vengeful spirits. And those spirits are part of everyday life in contemporary Vietnam. These books are anthropological accounts of how people understand ghosts, the social life of ghosts, like how they live with ghosts among them. And they're just incredible. Honit Kwan, who wrote the book on the left and in the center, is just a magnificent observer of these, I think, really touching, moving, poignant accounts. And Mylan Gustafson, who unfortunately just passed last year, was Vietnamese, and so had a really close, nuanced perspective, again, on the lives of ghosts. So all this is to say that the American casualties in the chart that we saw with the comparison to the 1918 flu and coronavirus, 58,220 dead Americans, that is terrible. Of course, that's absolutely tragic, but it does not begin to scratch the surface of the costs of our war in Vietnam. If you've spent time in Vietnam, I wonder if anybody has, you know that people there do not typically express grievances against Americans, amazingly. But Americans have continued to hold grievances against the Vietnamese. And if you know anything about the career of John McCain, you may be aware of how mainstream US opinion about the war was shaped. So McCain was a Republican senator who was a Navy pilot during the Vietnam War. And famously, he was shot down over Hanoi and held as a prisoner of war for 6 years in Hoa Lo prison, which is also called the Hanoi Hilton. And this is a very famous photograph of McCain returning from his time as a prisoner of war on crutches due to the injuries he received during his detention, meeting Richard Nixon. As Americans, I think we are largely socialized to be outraged by this story and to feel a kind of moral disgust at the Vietnamese regime that was capable of perpetrating this sort of abuse. So McCain was tortured, and the details of what that meant have been debated, but hence the crutches. And for much of his career, McCain openly used slurs when he was speaking about Vietnamese people. And this view of North Vietnamese as torturers, as subhuman, was not a fringe view. This quote by General William Westmoreland, that the so-called Oriental sees life as cheap, and forgive my language, this is a particularly notorious example of how individuals at the highest levels of US command perceive their enemies. And this is how it becomes easy, I think, to see John McCain as a hero, having courageously resisted mistreatment by the North Vietnamese. But here we might ask, did Vietnamese people see life as cheap? Or do Americans? What gets left out of McCain's narrative is his entirely normalized wartime activities of bombing towns and cities across North Vietnam. These are activities that killed tens of thousands of civilians, and that is what he was doing when his aircraft was shot down. For bigger picture, in total, the US expended at least 4 million tons of bombs over Vietnam and neutral Cambodia. The US also sprayed some 13 million gallons of chemical defoliant, including Agent Orange, which you may be familiar with, over Vietnam and neutral Laos and neutral Cambodia. Those chemicals are continuing to cause birth defects in children born today. There's just a big piece in the New York Times about this. Children being born in Laos with the characteristic kinds of disability that are created by parents or grandparents' exposure to these chemicals. Over the course of the war, it's not known, but estimates suggest that between 2 and 3 million Vietnamese civilians died. So again, numbers that are so big that we don't really have a frame of reference for what they mean or how they would affect a country or how they would affect a community. Uncounted, I think we really do not know how many Vietnamese people were injured, orphaned, widowed, disabled, etc. Okay, but again, those infographics that we looked at on the losses of the war only include Americans. And when we write op-eds about the war, we don't mention those enduring consequences. Okay, so again, where are we going with this? This is an example of collective forgetting, which can, again, sometimes be a way of letting go of the past, releasing grievances. But collective forgetting by powerful groups or nations can also enable abuses to be repeated. The novelist and critic Viet Thanh Nguyen, who wrote a really much admired book called The Sympathizer, you guys might be aware, and also this book about the war called Nothing Ever Dies. He calls this unjust forgetting. And here's a quote I wanted to share with you, where he writes, "The sign of unjust forgetting is repetition. If we repeat a history of violence, then we have not addressed the root causes of that violence. Hence, our current predicament in America. We are caught in a time warp of perpetual violence. America's wars have seemed to go on forever, at least for Americans who live eternally in the present." So, lots to reflect on here, but to sum up, I want to suggest that collapsing COVID-19 into the history of US foreign wars is intended to dignify the pandemic and to alert Americans to its dangers. And that is a good intention. But our use of the history of the Vietnam War in particular to make that case, I think actually makes it harder for us to understand the pandemic. And given that our history of the Vietnam War is already very one-sided and US-centric, I think we contribute to erasing that history when we memorialize COVID in those terms. So when we say, for example, COVID-19 is our era's Vietnam, we're kind of arguing that we needed to intervene in Vietnam just as we need to fight the current pandemic. So it's like we're retrospectively giving ourselves permission to have done that. But if we remembered the war more accurately, I think, and if our memory of the war was more encompassing, inclusive of that war's effects on everyone, then these comparisons, which I think are kind of lazily drawn between COVID-19 and the Vietnam War, those comparisons would just kind of fall apart. They would not seem to make sense. So how are we going to remember COVID-19? Your thoughts are welcome about this. I'm going to be wrapping up in about a page, and I have some thoughts, but like I do not have the answer to this question. So maybe we will have some conversation here. At this point, I think it's really fair to say that we do not know how we will remember this pandemic. There have been some temporary memorials established for COVID-19 deaths, mostly led by grassroots groups, families of people who have passed. Here's one in the United Kingdom. This has been getting a lot of media recently. You may have seen that this is family members who have lost someone to COVID-19 painting hearts on a wall in central London. They've lost 150,000 people in Britain, I think. And if you see video of this wall, it just goes and goes. So they too have the problem of like representing big numbers in a way that is moving. Here are some, I think probably temporary, in both cases, probably temporary memorials that have been established in the United States. But I think it still really remains to be seen what groups will be claiming the pandemic, stepping up to make those losses theirs, creating forms of social memory that are maybe more enduring. And at this moment in time, I think the enormity of these losses, like what they really, really mean, the enormity has been disavowed and denied in ways. But I think those deaths are going to come back to us somehow. And this is because of precedent. Okay, so I mentioned that the Vietnam War was very unpopular, yeah? People did not even think there would be a memorial built after our soldiers came home. And that memorial has ended up becoming absolutely iconic. There was a lot of struggle over what it was going to look like, you know, what kind of message it would be sending about the war, you know, how it, you know, sort of put form on that complicated history. But there it is, that memorial. And same, I think, story or similar story with the memorialization of HIV in this country, which again was very disavowed. People who died of HIV for a long time were, you know, really socially marginalized. As a result of, you know, the creativity and endurance of activists, we ended up getting, for example, the Names Project, the HIV memorial quilt that some of you may be familiar with. And that too has been a really iconic, powerful cultural symbol of those ambiguous losses. So when Americans do start commemorating COVID, that might look like memorials, like the kinds of like symbolic representations of loss that you see on the screen. I hope very much that this will not look like the way that we have, for the most part, remembered the Vietnam War. I hope that Hollywood and other like powerful players in the culture industry, I hope that they will not co-opt this history and give us like a kind of Disney version of what just happened this past year. I hope that we will seek metaphors that inspire a critical awareness of what caused the pandemic to get so out of control in this country. And I also hope that we will go beyond gestures that only work at the level of culture. I hope we press for a social safety net that really protects everybody. I hope we find ways to hold institutions accountable now and going forward. To refer back to Viet Thanh Nguyen's idea of unjust memory and unjust forgetting, I think we need to ask, how are we going to represent this history equitably? How are we going to understand the root causes of the pandemic? And as we begin to remember and commemorate the pandemic, how can we engage in memory work that continues to point us in those directions? And this is where I want to stop. Invite your questions by email if you would like to follow up that way, and to have a little bit of a conversation in the time we have remaining.
Excellent. Thank you so much. The students have a lot of questions, also a lot of great comments. A lot of students said thank you for the way that you talked about the Vietnam War and the additional information you gave them. A lot of students acknowledged that the way their education taught them about the Vietnam War was problematic, and also people from Vietnam who are in the class who really appreciated your words. Yeah. Also some students from Ireland and Northern Ireland who really appreciated that framing of this situation. Also talking about how those divides and biases even got brought with their families to the Americas. And also students recognizing that in St. Louis, it's actually very common for people to ask what high school you went to also, because that's something actually that I've heard a lot since I moved here, and a lot of students were commenting on it as well and saying, it's a way to gauge someone's socioeconomic status, but also someone noted that previously it not only could tell you socioeconomic status, but also religion and political views. So a lot of things that people really connected to here. Also, there were a lot of questions about how we understand this in terms of what's happened with HIV. So I think the fact that you touched on that at the end also was great. There's so many wonderful questions here. I think I'll start with this. You compared, you discussed 9/11 and the sort of media coverage after 9/11. And there were several questions about 9/11, even before you started talking about it, and then also after. And students also noticing, the way we talk about and the way we dealt with 9/11 being so different than how we're dealing with the pandemic and the loss of lives in the pandemic. And one student asked, are people's motivations and opinions in the US dictated more by xenophobia than the loss of American life? And why, another question related to that is, why is 9/11 remembered differently? So one student kind of trying to suggest maybe why it's remembered differently, and another student just more open-ended question of why is it remembered differently?
Right. I'm scribbling down a couple quick notes, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah, wonderful questions, wonderful comments. And before I jump into content, let me just say it's great that this course is so big, that there's that much geographic diversity to have representation from Vietnam and Ireland and Northern Ireland. I'm delighted that, we have a big group here from many places, and thanks for your supportive comments about my comments on your parts of the world. So about people's opinions being dictated by xenophobia versus loss of life, I think this is an endlessly fascinating and important question, and everything you all are bringing up is really worthwhile. But since that was the last or the first question with a real question mark, I'm going to go there and say, it's definitely worth reflecting on the way that Americans assess risk and the way that risks are understood to line up with issues like race, nationality, and religion. And I do think it's been very challenging to get Americans to be concerned about real, material sources of risk that appear to originate from a place that is close to them sociologically. And the reason that I say that is in part because this week I'm reading a book about the Sackler family called Empire of Pain. And the Sacklers are the folks who own Purdue Pharmaceuticals, which produced OxyContin, the drug. And they are, they're really normal seeming people with a great deal of power and influence. And their activities with that drug created endless amounts of public health harm in this country. And the way the story is told in this book, which I really recommend, deeply underscores, I think, the reality that it's just very hard for us to perceive institutionally, white upper middle class people or white, very wealthy people like the Sacklers as a potential source of harm, false information, risk. And I think that something similar, we're still understanding probably what happened with the coronavirus, but I think the reassurance that Trump and his supporters offered, the false reassurance that he offered about the risks of coronavirus, seemed very credible to a big part of the American population. And the way that, race and risk perception played into that false reassurance, I think is noteworthy. So again, this is just to say, very interesting framing and like worth more thought and comment, I think. Why we remember September 11th differently, I think there was just so, first of all, like that was an undeniably dramatic, catastrophic experience. There was no way to watch it on TV and think, this is overblown by the media. It was clearly not overblown by the media. And it was not intended to be, it was intended to be shocking. So, people were reasonably shocked. But then the consolidation of national opinion about what we needed to do, like the way that people on all sides of the political spectrum aligned to support a war was really something. That experience of unity, if we want to call it that, was so total that I think September 11th got passed into kind of our national mythos in a way that other events really have not. And it got a kind of aura around it. I think we tend to remember the people who were lost in those events, again, in a kind of sanctified way. There's kind of like a quasi-religious feeling around September 11th. And indeed, it was really important. Like it was the justification for all the forever wars that we've been pursuing ever since.
Yes. And I think along that line and slightly shifting, a lot of students are wondering, you said, I don't know how we will remember this, but they're wondering, similar to the Vietnam War, do we risk the chance that in high schools and, elementary schools and whatnot, we're going to do a bad job of teaching about the pandemic in the same way that we do a bad job of teaching about the Vietnam War? And related to that, I think also there were several questions about how collective memory doesn't have to be correct, right? Like, there are Holocaust deniers, for example. And so students were commenting on like also COVID deniers, how we could, I think, I link these two topics because I could kind of see how then what ends up happening is that we could have the history books end up telling this collective memory that actually isn't all that accurate, right? What are your thoughts on those topics?
I think it's highly likely that we will do a bad job of teaching about the pandemic. And it's, unfortunately the case, I think in general, that most curriculum, especially for young students, ends up being extremely whitewashed and extremely ideologically manipulated to tell, a conservative story. And when I say a conservative story, I don't mean necessarily a right-wing story, but a story that does not radicalize the student, and a story that essentially normalizes and kind of reassures, rather than suggesting, like this was a really exceptional, there was something like exceptionally crazy that happened, and it's not resolved. We didn't settle it. It's still a problem. I think most, approved curriculum really can't tell a story that way. So I think it will be left to other parts of the culture to keep the story open in a way that troubles us, and that we find perhaps like less neat and less packaged and less soothing. As far as the possible future outcome of like, traction by COVID deniers, I think we're seeing that already, maybe not in quite as institutionalized a form as like a school curriculum, but I do think that we have much to understand and resolve in this country about those kind of, revisionist histories. And I'm not sure that there's much that we can do about that. It's something that I think about and worry about frequently, and I don't know what we should be doing differently as a society to prevent those kind of conspiratorial accounts from getting traction and becoming persuasive.
Yeah, and I think another thing that relates to that, and that the students were asking about, is that in all of these other situations where there's been this tragic event that we've then formed a collective memory about, we've been able to do that together. But with COVID, we have had to be separate. And so not only are we not forming these memories together necessarily, but also pointed out the importance of the collective grieving process. And they're wondering how missing out on that communal grieving process is, affecting us now, and also kind of going to shape, as you're talking about, the memory of COVID.
Right. Great question. I think we really have been alone together in a way that is essentially unprecedented, more or less unprecedented. And so having, for example, like having so much of this experience be given to us by media, especially those of us who have had the luxury of remaining home and working from home over this past year, has really, I think it's really alienated us from what would be our more typical uses of, for example, like a shared space or like a shared social interaction to process those losses more naturally. Part of me thinks that this is, something that will defer, and like at some future point when it's safer for us to be out in public, we will get around to grieving these losses. And another part of me, I think, worries that, news cycles will move forward and the culture will move forward. And even as people continue to struggle with losses in their private lives, there will not be like a timely venue for them to receive the support of the community. And so I think this is a question to watch. If anybody's thinking about like future thesis topics, this would be a really worthwhile future thesis topic. Like, how do we incorporate, the timeline of grieving as a social phenomenon into our lives when we cannot come together?
Absolutely. And I think, at least based on my experience with this class and the questions that we get every week, people are thirsty for trying to understand how this is going to work out moving forward. So I agree. I hope that some people are able to do a careful study of that and give us some tools, because I think many of us are, just trying our best and really unsure what's next to come. But one thing that we do try and do in this class is cultivate a sense of community, and at least if we are all supporting each other moving forward, hopefully we'll find a way through. So we actually only have a couple more minutes. So there's actually a ton of questions, and I'm sorry that we can't get to all of them, but is there any last message that you want to leave the students with?
Yeah, I guess I do have one last message, which is this. I think, whatever consensus our society arrives at about the meaning of this experience, it's very important for us to be actively critically forming our own memories and keeping track of those, because something that I have learned as an anthropologist is if I don't write something down, fascinating conversation I have with somebody, like little transcendent experience, it is gone. So I actually have done a lot of keeping track of events over the past year in my own life, and it has helped orient me mentally and personally. If you haven't been doing that, you can start now. And I think it will help you in the future to have some kind of reference, even if it's very simple and small.
That's such a great suggestion. I've found that things that I think there's no way I could possibly forget this, now that it's been a year, they're gone, right? So that's such a good suggestion. Well, thank you so much. This has been fascinating, and I really appreciate it. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Yes, absolutely. For the rest of you, we will see you next week. Until then, stay safe.